We do not support cannibalism. We don't.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Irenicast of 2016. We are the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thank you so much for joining us this week for our very first episode of the year. And this week, I think appropriately, when we hit the new year, we are always talking about this idea of newness. And hopefully our goal at the beginning of the year with our New Year's resolutions are, I'm trying to be a better person, I'm trying to move forward, I'm trying to progress as a person, and hopefully bring people along with me. So that's going to be our topic, is this idea of the myth of progress. Or basically, we're going to be answering or trying to answer the question, is the world getting better or worse? Or is that even a question that misses the whole point of how we should look at history and moving forward? And then for our segment this week, we're going to be sharing our New Year's resolutions or lack thereof. Yeah, so let's get into this. Maybe we should start with the first question is, I have a feeling that we're probably on different pages with this, but basically, do you feel we are moving forward and progressing or not as a species?
Man, that's a really freaking complicated question. There's about 300 years of philosophy that's debating that. So I'm looking at it in like a philosophical, theoretical, macro sense, but you can certainly look at it on an individual level as well. And I think
so. Mona's up on the mountaintop, is what we're hearing.
Well, it's funny though, because all of us actually have internalized ideas of this that might be conditioned by our personal outlook on the world, where our vantage point is in the world, like what country we live in, what neighborhood we live in, how up to date we are in current events, or what kind of news sources we listen to. But even if we articulate it or not,
how empowered, right? And how empowered we are, like politically and economically.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And whether we articulate it or not, most of us have some kind of understanding or opinion on the matter. Is the world getting better or worse?
I should note as we move forward, we are going to be scraping, because this idea, when we talked about it, is very close to the idea of eschatology, or when we talk about the biblical end time stuff. So we're going to scratch the surface maybe with that idea, but next week we are going to use the idea of end times, or the theological term eschatology, and kind of go another step with this whole idea. So I just want to put that out
because
front.
those two ideas of are we progressing and what are we headed toward kind of go hand in hand. They are different, but they definitely complement each other.
Yeah,
sure.
And both have to do with both history and future. So how you look at the past and how you look at what we're going toward, like you said. But it's more complicated than just optimism and pessimism from everything that I've read on this subject. That certainly has some to do with it, though. There's that just whether you're basically in life an optimist or a pessimist will have to do with even scholars who write on this will have to do with how they see it. So what do you guys personally think about this?
I am a huge proponent of the myth of progress, so much so that I don't like calling it the myth of progress. And I'm sure we'll get more into that, but I do believe we are on a positive trajectory headed towards the future.
What determines that positive trajectory?
Well, I think as we kind of talk about this, we'll throw some stuff out there, but I think we all probably have our own barometers as far as what we judge and base that on. But for me, I look at it in terms of, and I know it doesn't feel like it, especially your context. It was hard for me to get to a place where I felt like we were moving forward, because I was bombarded growing up in church with Jesus is coming, the world's going to get worse before it gets better. And then every news item that we have that gives that idea fuel, we raise it up against all the other news items that are positive and counteract that. And I think that whenever there is some kind of, and especially now, whenever there's some kind of attack or violence or anything like that, it feels as though the world is getting worse. And I know some people barometer that by, people's sexual preference, which I don't, obviously. There's gay marriage, so now we're even worse off than we were. But I look at it in terms of like violence and freedom for people. And I know there's still a lot of work to be done in that area, and I'll put some links into the show notes. There's a TED Talk that was done by this guy named what's his name? Steven Pinker. And he talked about how we are living in the least violent time in the history of the world. And they
call it the long peace, is what I've heard.
Exactly. And I think that there's a lot of validity to that. And then I just look at the more recent history of our own country, obviously a narrow focus, but there is movements forward. And I think just like anything else, it's a pendulum swing. We overcompensate, we undercompensate. And if you look at the graph of, if there was a graph on how better or worse we are doing, I think there are definitely times where we revert and go down, but I still see the overall trajectory as an upward movement.
So just to clarify one thing though, you said something about gay marriage being like a sign of things declining. That's not the opinion of the people on the show, just for clarification.
No, I'm saying that would be an opinion that I've grown up with and that I'm still exposed to. So everyone has their different barometer on what makes the world good.
So that's actually why I feel like it's difficult for this conversation for me. It's hard to gauge whether progress is infinite material progress or like there's an infinite breakdown from some better past, because you have to answer the question like, what are humans for, or what is the world for? And that's the fancy word for that is teleology. We talked about that off air a little bit, but like if you can't answer the question what the purpose is of a person, then it's difficult to determine whether there is progression or not, right? Like, is my sole existence to create stock shares for a corporation that benefits off of my work? Because if that's true, then maybe, like there's a progress because people are making unprecedented strides in wealth accrual in our country. But if that's not what I'm for, then maybe the progression is an illusion. So I think those initial questions are harder to ask.
In academia, at least, teleology's been kind of largely rejected because you can't prove ends. You can't prove it. And it's not quite helpful for us to ask those kinds of questions.
It is theologically.
Well, no, a lot of theologians don't look at, they reject telos as well, So that's the whole
so what that is like
itself.
The ancient way of looking at it was like in Greek philosophy, you'd look at something and say, what is a thing for? And you could determine its existence based on, is it being used for the thing for which it was destined? Like, is the acorn going into the ground, creating the tree kind of thing? That was Aristotle. That's its telos, as it's meant to become a fully grown oak tree. And when I look at human beings and I look at progress and that kind of stuff, for me, it is a pressing question. Like, what are human beings for? Like, what is the purpose of a human being? And I think people have moved away from that because they bought into nihilism.
That's not think... No, come on. That is not the opposite of teleology.
Hold on. It's not. But I don't agree with the idea of progress that the Enlightenment has kind of portrayed. And since then, so I think there's a lot of philosophers that I would agree with that have criticized that. But on the other side, like Nietzsche basically was one of the biggest opponents of the myth of progress. And he was like the father of that, right? I mean,
he was not a nihilist. He was not a nihilist.
Intrinsic.
No, he wanted to bring people back to their creatureliness and life in the present. And he comes across as like a nihilist. I love Nietzsche, so I will like, I'm sorry, getting a little intense, but he'll come across as like a Bachian, like somebody who just lives for pleasure or who finds no purpose in the earth. But Nietzsche's whole point was like, if human beings, the telos of human beings is anything other than being human beings, we get ourselves in ethical trouble, in moral trouble. So like if you say the point of humans is to be happy, you get into John Stuart Mill area where you're saying, well, we're just all supposed to chase happiness all the time and utility. And therefore it's okay for governments to make decisions that punish some for the happiness of others, So
yeah, because for him, he looked at like the depth of human reality, right? Like the pit of human reality was to be a human being, and that didn't mean being happy all the time because humans weren't happy all the time, right?
Well,
is
that's
that what
missing
you're saying?
The point. No, he definitely like would embrace a happiness, but for him, happiness is coming back to our creatureliness and our and the fact that we're bound and we come from the earth, and to be in the present moment and to embrace all of what we are leads to happiness, but happiness is not the end point. Happiness is kind of a natural outcome or a symptom of embracing who you are. So he mocks a lot of institutions. He even mocks the academy. In the book, I highly recommend Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He writes, people who study for a living are just basically in a room by themselves building these little things and then destroying them. And like they lose touch with the outside world. So
that's a really interesting book. It's like an allegorical, like classical portrayal of his philosophy.
He wrote it as kind of a response to Christian scriptures and canon, and it's a beautiful work. I totally recommend it. And he's
they make a
misunderstood
movie?
a lot.
Did they make?
I don't think you could make a movie of this one.
Yes, you can. It would just be lots of dialogue.
Yeah. So let's talk about this myth, the scientific or the Enlightenment myth, because it's, in the Enlightenment you had like Newton or pre-Enlightenment, all these people, and Da Vinci inventing these phenomenal things. So there's kind of like a general faith in technology and society building based on the work of Immanuel Kant. He did a lot of work on, what social relation is, which is funny because Kant didn't really have like very good social skills. So he studies it like from very much an outsider perspective. What does it mean to like build the ecclesia or like the community of people who are moral together? And what does it mean to do right by each other? And this is also the age of colonization, where governments would send out envoys and missionaries and colonize and take, charge of other people's land, with under the understanding that their job was to spread Christianity and freedom and emerging democracy throughout the whole world, because this would civilize the whole world and create order and morality and encourage technological growth, and that would lead to a better world in general. So actually democracy is a myth of progress in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. The Western civilization itself, there's some people who argue that it's built into Western civilization, the idea that what we have going on is an upward progression, and that's something that's going to increase and spread. But the technology thing is really interesting. I think a lot of people, it's a powerful tool when you have, for instance, a new iPhone come out. Is it every year, Jeff? Is that right?
Yep.
Like every single year. That's crazy. But anyway, you have some better technology in our lifetime. We have demonstrable, planned steps that have shown us, like, next year you can count on being able to do more things than you were able to do this year. So that idea of science and enlightenment progression toward a technological future where things get easier and better for all people, we see that like demonstrated every single year. But the question is, like, is there an underside to technology that has been hidden by this idea of progression?
That's
What would you
perfectly,
say?
I think that's perfectly stated. I have in my margin here of my notes, 20th century technology. It like really mirrors the Enlightenment mythos, which is so funny that you said that. Because I think what it is, and the myth of progress is like, have you ever seen like a limit in calculus? This might be too far gone for some people, but it's like a curve. It's a curve that infinitely approaches a line, but never gets there. But it gets infinitely more and more and more and more close. So if the line is perfect human well-being, what humanity does is in the limit, we try to get as close as we can. We try to approximate and we try to get more and more and more close to it. But the problem is, how do you define human well-being? Right? So
Yes.
So people have different conceptions of what perfect human well-being is. And the question is, how do we gauge whether our efforts are on that curve toward human well-being or not? Like, for example, cell phones have created a lot of human well-being, you could argue. You can't prove it, but you could argue that. But mining the materials for cell phone, like coltan, has destroyed entire countries in Africa and caused immeasurable human suffering and loss, and is not sustainable. Or you could say all of
but before you move on from there, it's also
Sure.
not sustainable in the sense that releasing new versions of phones every year has pushed technology to better and better heights, but at the same time, we are stripping minerals from the surface of the earth that are almost impossible to get to further down. So we're basically like selling out our future to have new versions of stuff every single year. They're not going to be able to use the same material that we have. It's going to be so much more difficult for them to create.
Yeah,
in
and
the
that's
future.
and that's why people argue capitalism itself is not sustainable, because it creates an infinite demand and a drive forward that outpaces what we can sustainably do with the environment or our resources, and therefore capitalism kind of gobbles itself up over time. So that's the question: what is human well-being for all people? Because human well-being for me sometimes comes at the cost of human well-being for other people. And And what does it mean to spread human rights and freedom and democracy? Do we have this emerging world order, or do we have just an infinitely richer class and an infinitely poorer class of people
and
globally?
I would say that beyond that, theologically for me, because of my theological makeup, those questions move beyond human well-being to the entire planet, like to the entire created order. Because I am a Christian, I see like our good and health and human good being connected to the good of animals and ecosystems and all sorts of things. And you can make that argument whether you're a Christian or not. But for me, that's part of like, that's why I wanted to bring up teleologies. I do believe we do have a purpose. Like I believe that we are supposed to be caretakers. Not that the world was created in 7 days or that the Genesis account is literal. Maybe it's something we're evolving into, but I do believe we're supposed to take care of one another and the earth. And I can't prove that, but that's a part of my faith.
What if taking care of the earth means like, we stop making technology and populations decline and people die? And like, what if it means sacrificing in order to do that?
It's obviously a balancing act. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think that's why we can't necessarily look at this issue in a micro level, right? I mean, we can't look at like an instance, like let's use technology as an example. You can't look at the fact that, okay, we're making more iPhones every year, but it's causing this environmental damage and damage for this people group because we're taking this resource or whatever. Like, yeah, that's happening in the moment, but then there's also the fact, like, if not for the technology, then you wouldn't have more and more people aware that that's happening to even call it out and say
that's true.
Say, well, we need to stop that. So that's why I said before, it seems to be like you have to look at the macro.
But that's so hypocritical.
What do you mean?
To say,
like,
hey, we should stop
you...
that, but I'm benefiting from it, so I'm going to like look like a good person to say, hey, stop mining for coltan on my new iPhone. Like,
but that's what we do.
How can I say that? That is what we do, but it's not right.
But that's what I'm saying, is that's what we do right now, but that doesn't mean we're not in the midst of a pendulum swing where, okay, now we've identified these two things that seems contradictory. How do we find that balance to kind of make things better? And I think the only way we can do that is to first be aware of it. So it is kind of a paradox in the sense that the only reason we're aware of it is because they're doing it. But if we look at the macro of it, then maybe, 3-4 decades from now, we've kind of found the solution, or we found a new material. Because even though we do release iPhones every year, they are using different materials every couple years or so because they find a new material or whatever. Like, I'm not saying that these things aren't bad, but I'm saying is that doesn't mean that we're not in the midst of change.
I do want to say, though, that that's tokenism. Like, there are corporations who give little pieces of truth and who look like they are a part of some moral progress, but that is illusory. That they're doing, they're always hiding more than they're showing. That's good business.
No,
practice.
I agree with that.
And I think that, like, our technology has given us the ability to see how evil we really are. I don't know.
No, but that's I'm using that as an example. I'm not saying that as like a definitive whatever.
Oh, sure.
But at the same time, there is there's a nugget of truth in that. And
there's
I'm saying
two sides to one coin, is what you're saying.
We
I'm
have
saying we
faith
can't.
that we'll eventually find a more sustainable energy source, for example, besides fossil fuels. And people are working on that, but we're actually not putting. In the grand scheme of things, we're actually not putting that much resources to finding that, like, compared to other exploits that we do in the U.S., right?
And if we don't, this is really interesting. If we don't find that alternative fuel source, the problem is we are driving our cars and using a natural resource, the same natural resource that, like, flies airplanes. We are spending all of that resource on kind of dumb stuff. Like, I get in my car to go buy a banana at the store instead of waiting till I go grocery shopping a few days later, right? I expend fossil fuels and oil on things that I could probably wait to do. And the problem is, if you look into our future, human future, it looks like progress, but what happens when we don't find that alternative fuel source? And instead, we've spent all of the things. People can no longer fly. We can't,
Oh, no. It's not just about travel. We have 6,000 household items made out of oil. We're talking like anything plastic in your home. Bras.
Okay, I think we're venturing into a new episode.
Well,
but what I'm trying to say with all that,
I'm saying, connected. Like, our entire way of life and being in the world is completely jeopardized if we don't have fossil fuels and oil.
Okay,
so
a match looks like progression. All I'm trying to say is this: that's one symptom of the larger thing. You talked about the way we have set up the entire world is gobbling itself up. It's actually true. Like a match looks like progression, right? And it could be that we're going to infinitely get brighter and brighter into the future and, for billions of years. Or it could be that we have this initial technological progression, but really what's happening is we're using everything up and we don't even realize it because we can't see past our own timeline.
True. And my example was not meant to give a specific like, this is the way that we can tell what's going on. But what I meant by that is that when we talk about this issue, we can't just look at what's happening now with some kind of speculation, as accurate as it may be, of the future, without looking at an issue and being like, okay, so this is what it is like now. We have to, if we're going to answer this question, are we getting better or worse? We have to then look at it and compare it to what's happened before, and then balance that with what we see and speculate for what's going to happen in the future. So it's this balancing act between the past, present, and future. And if we stick in any one of those realms, then I don't think we're appropriately addressing this issue or this question.
Right, but there are whole realms of science that can actually tell us pretty definitively, like environmentalism, like, no, we're heading toward a fiery end. Like, we need,
hottest year ever. Absolutely.
So, okay.
True,
so,
but like, hypothetically speaking, what if someone invents something that reverses some of that we haven't thought of? Like, I'm saying that...
See, that's
but
why
we're
it's a
banking
myth.
on it. We're banking on it happening. We're going into debt over it happening, but we don't know for sure that we can make hydrogen fuel work, for example.
So that's why it's called a myth, is it has a belief structure.
Yes.
Is that people believe science will save us.
Yes.
And we're setting ourselves up to fail with the expectation that science will catch us as we're falling off the cliff.
Okay, so then what I think we're really
heights.
talking about here is not like, do we believe we're getting better, but do we believe that we have the potential as people to be better, and it's our choice?
Yeah, and there's a third kind of way to look at it. And so two of the most famous people who've written on this are two philosophers in the 19th century, Hegel and Marx. So if I can just summarize, I think this would help the conversation if I talk about these.
Oh no,
guys
she's talking about Marx.
You guys, I love Marx. Come on. Okay. All right. So Hegel writes about that every historical age has a spirit. And he has a famous quote that says, "The march of God or spirit in the world is history." So let that sink in for a second. I think like a lot of people would see this as conducive to Christian theology, perhaps. This spirit kind of is this giant, like this high level thing that will take us to a better high level thing next time. And he said conflict occurs between states or spirits transferring. So big conflicts that we've known in the world are when we're having a transition from a past age to a future age, or a past age to a present age. So all tools of the spirit and self realization are important, right? So like war, for example, Hegel says is an engine of progress, which gets uncomfortable for a lot of us. But we also see that to be true in history to some degree. Like, for example, World War II is the reason that we have dishwashers and washing machines for our homes. So you can kind of see some evidence for Hegel's theory being correct, that the processes of development come through conflict, and that each age has a spirit, and that God's presence marches through history to take us to a better place. Okay, so that's Hegel. Marx flipped that on its head and said it's not the spirit, the material, the productive forces, and that human uplift over time tends toward equal sharing of resources, and that's where you get Marxian communism. So Marx was really focused on the resource aspect of labor and production and how that would bring us into a more humanitarian time. So both of these theories have been largely debunked in academic circles. Why? Because of the 20th century. Because we saw nuclear war, we saw the Holocaust, we saw decolonization and development struggles of countries who have perpetually had a hard time developing, mostly because, in the words of later, more contemporary philosophers, like Foucault and Said, that improvement has only, like myths of progress really benefit the most powerful people, and that the powerful people, the powerful nations, the powerful forces in the world will only allow countries to develop if it benefits them. And so there's a notion of that progress is a tool of control, that more poor people or countries have to have the permission or the tutelage of powerful people, and so they're really beholden to power structures. So what do we do with industrial sprawl and slums and giant waves of human suffering that have come from our push toward technology and our push toward development? And how do we prove that every spirit has an age that ultimately marches towards God's will? We can't prove that. We don't know that. And we see instances in really modern history where people are just really awful to each other and still have horrific, even in all of our work the past 300 centuries, all of our work to be a better world, we still have horrific capacity to destroy each other. And human nature is like a blink of an eye away from being in the place where we're ready to blow each other up. So we're not getting better. That's what people say. We're not getting better.
From a like Christian perspective, that like terminology, the spirit of the age, is very ancient and like philosophical and religious. There's this in the New Testament idea that the spirit of the age isn't always in step with the spirit of God. And the goal of like at least Jesus or Christianity is to recall that spirit back to a more divine purpose, like what God has purposed it for. So it's really interesting to consider. Like I love the like emergence theory and stuff like that. Like all the parts can't explain the whole. And that's kind of what I hear you saying is all of society has this bigger whole that is producing downward effects on like regular people. It's marching history in a certain direction. And I think that's true. And I think that needs to be looked at. And
well, I'm thinking of like for example, that we in our world today in US society and globalist societies, corporations are largely becoming almost more powerful than governments. Does that mean that progress has led us there and that's a natural outcome, or is that a corruption of progress and a corruption of democracy? Like, which is it?
Okay,
you know what I mean?
I see. Okay, yeah. So that actually reminded me of what I was thinking of. By the way, there's a YouTube video from the Idea channel from PBS. It's really interesting about corporations as myths, like mythology of corporations. Really interesting. I'll put that in the show notes. But what I was thinking of, when you're measuring like human good, it gets really complicated. And I guess that's my only point for this conversation, is that yes, you can look at like, for instance, trends of human lifespans. I don't think there's any human being on the planet that would say longer lifespans are bad. Like that's a good goal for technology to have. We should be living longer and expanding our life. Like that's a good thing to me theologically. But the problem is if you read like medical literature and you speak to people who are in the medical communities, there's a lot of human suffering that has come about because we have technology to increase our lifespans. Like, yes, longer life, but at what cost kind of thing. There's a lot of end-of-life questions that are now being really discussed that have been taboo in the past. But there's just a lot of difficulty that comes with living longer. And I think everybody can see that. And maybe technology will save us. Maybe we'll be able to transport our consciousness into a robot and be eventually flying through the universe by ourselves in a little metal contraption with nobody around us because everything's spreading out from each other. But that's a different story.
Well, I'm pretty sure that artificial intelligence is going to control us in like my lifetime. So I'm pretty dang sure. So what
you're
does
like,
it matter?
This question's moot.
The robots are going to take over, and then the robots are probably
tell us what human goodness is. Right?
They're going to tell us. Yeah, they're probably going to save the environment, and they're probably they'll make us like a slave class, maybe, but they'll probably make the world better. No, I'm completely joking. That's a terrible thing to joke about. But did you know we just created a robot? Where was it? Stanford or MIT? Something. Put a link. That will say no to humans. They have that technology now. Like if you tell the robot, this particular robot, to like jump off the edge of the table, it'll like measure that there's a ledge coming and it'll be like, no, I'm not going to do it. So we're close, people. Oh my God.
Oh my gosh.
I know. So, okay. So here's my question. Why does it matter if we measure progress or not? Because the myth of progress, whether you love it or hate it, the idea that progress is good has spurned humans to reach for the stars, literally, right? Has spurned us, like this whole space exploration age. Like we're going to go into a new, better age of history where we can explore space. That's why we spend all this money going to the moon or whatever. Like the belief in it, whether it's real or not, whether it's legitimate or not, whether it's something we ought to believe in or not, has caused us to do great things. for better or for worse.
And I love that. I personally am somebody who believes that we should be exploring the universe, that it's our destiny to live outside of our planet. Like, I buy into all that stuff wholeheartedly, theologically and religiously, but I think there needs to be a serious critique of that, a powerful like check and balance system where all of that stuff, the ends have to be justified by the means in my mind and for my religion. Like, you can't have a dishwasher at the expense of 70 million people dying in World War II. You know what I mean? Like, that's a really big, like, blown out of proportion example.
Point. Yeah, okay.
That wasn't the point you were making, but the point I'm making is, like,
yeah.
to get to Mars at the expense of human suffering, like, that can't be a part of the equation. And it doesn't have to be. Like, we can do science and we can do economics and other stuff ecologically. Like, we can think about the world in a healthy way, and people are proving that you don't have to rely upon this machine of 500 years of conquering and looting and exploiting people and, you know, pollution and other things that Chris Hedges points out. There's some really good like journalism out there about myth of progress and societies collapsing and all sorts of stuff. I'll put a link up to it. But you don't have to rely upon that to do good science. And we're discovering that, I guess, Jeff, because of science. No, not because of science, but
well,
anyway.
But you can't exist in the modern world without participating in this in some fashion. So, okay.
Yeah,
wait,
but you can lessen it, though, right? That's
true. If you like go live in the woods somewhere, I don't know.
Well, so that's always the difficulty for me, is that we have these feelings, right? We're like, you know what, something's not right about X or Y, and we want to change that, but it's so impossible to extricate myself from this world that is so interconnected. I'm going to participate. What that reminds me of, and I always tell myself, so I can at least do some good, is G.K. Chesterton said, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. So even if you can't do it all the way, if it's worth doing, you can do it at least a little bit, right? Like, we don't have to be perfectionists.
No, I don't know. I have a friend who like is so like environmentally conscious. I have a lot of friends. I have a lot of hippie friends who really like is mad about the way that fossil fuels run the world, and so she doesn't run her heater a lot. But she doesn't really make a difference. I'm sorry, but she just doesn't. In that, like, her singular person doesn't.
Still,
she doesn't. She doesn't run the heater, and she doesn't turn the lights on.
I
but
think
her husband is mad at her all the time.
You believe in the myth of too big to fail. That's what it is.
No, I'm saying that literally, if you look at the global use of fossil fuels and energy, one person, I mean, yeah, it's like if we had if you're part of a mass movement of people, but one person just living in the dark and cold really honestly doesn't do anything. I'm just being a realist.
But there is a mass of people, and it is changing. And so that one person, if she can inspire one other person, it has a ripple effect.
Myth of progress!
Yeah, I know.
No, I
have
honestly don't think so.
Progress against the myth of progress.
That has to be a massive change over time that takes like incredible. And okay, for example, divestment. People always want to divest from fossil fuels. You know what happens when you divest from fossil fuels? Other people buy up cheaper shares of fossil fuels and the market goes up. It doesn't work unless you reinvest in clean energy and technological advances. But again, we don't know if those things are coming for sure. So divestment efforts, I'm sorry to say, like, it's a really great idea, but often people who are fighting for divestment don't really understand the economics of divestment. And they're actually helping oil companies, you know, so it doesn't, and people who would do moral things with the money that comes from those investments are no longer shareholders. And so they can't speak into how those shares and the shareholding is happening. So, okay. So I'm just saying, like, sometimes well-intended efforts either hurts the person, only it really hurts the person. It doesn't do any good, or actually helps the people who are trying to be greedy and control the world and destroy it. So, be careful. Like, do your homework. You know,
that's a point. That's a point well taken. You're right. There is always the probability that what you're going to do might cause more harm. And you can look at some recycling efforts. There's been people that have pointed that out, that sometimes it creates more pollution than the opposite.
Until you get a critical mass. Well, yeah, and recycling some items costs more energy than actually it puts back into. Yeah, like I think recycling glass in particular costs more energy and uses more fossil fuels than just putting it in a landfill. So it's not helping us, actually.
But you don't think that there's another side of that, in the sense that we're looking at a snapshot. Like, you're right. You're right, Mona. Like, you do this, it's really not going to make that big of a difference. However, and then we're talking about this mass movement, but sometimes those mass movements, they start because they need some kind of symbol. So even though recycling is not doing necessarily what it should in the moment, over time, it can become a symbol that pushes people forward into that mass change and saying we need to do something about that. Like, I'm thinking that we look so much in the present that we forget that maybe something's building from this token, if we want to call it that. But, you know, tokens start out as tokens, but they can end up being very powerful symbols that drive a whole culture, that drive a whole movement. Because in the midst of all this, you know, like the changing landscape of war, like you can make an argument that war is moving from the battlefield to, you know, corporate whatever, or even technology. There's a battlefield. You know, we have hackers, and, you know, sometimes warfare is being done that way. Like, we're changing these battlefields, but in the midst of it, in the midst of these new battlefields, so to speak, there's still protests. There's still people saying no, using the very way or putting themselves on that battlefield. And I think that we underestimate the human spirit. And we look so much at the facts and the statistics that we forget that all of these anomalies have happened because someone rises up, because a token symbol inspired them, and therefore they inspired a group of people.
That's a great point. No, and I think the major point I take from that is that people do it. It's not some external force like drawing us along. It's people standing up and saying, "No, cut it out. I'm not taking that anymore. We're going to change things." You know, you could argue that all of modern democracy is built on that. Is someone standing up and saying, "I'm not taking this anymore. We're changing." You know, like.
So that just gets directly at the point that I was going to bring up and ask you. We talk about human goodness or human health or something like that progress we're progressing toward, that infinite approach to that line. For you, Mona, is that line self-determination? Like the thing that, like we talked about Nietzsche, the thing about humans is they should be allowed to be humans. They should be allowed to make their own decisions and determine what their lives will look like. To you, is that like the ultimate human good?
Well, so
I know that's like the biggest question ever.
No, that's a good question. I'm trained in feminist theology and feminist theory. So for me, like, human flourishing is the ultimate good, and that's what will create the most moral uplift. And for me, like, human flourishing is usually you judge situations by the canary in the coal mine, and usually women of color are the people who have the least amount of human flourishing globally, the least amount of rights, the least amount of say, the least amount of economic empowerment, the most amount of systematic oppression. So I think, you know, there are some gauges to measure how women of color in particular are doing as a gauge for the whole of society. So I think.
So what I hear you're saying
human
is, yes,
flourishing.
You said human flourishing, but then you said the ability to determine, you know, their lives.
Well, how do you determine human rights. Flourishing? Yeah,
that's a good question. But I do think that for me, human flourishing is more than just self-determination. I think self-determination is a part of a bigger complex of what I look at human beings as being. That's why this conversation misses, so many different people, because we have different ideas of what human beings should be. And maybe it's like too psychological or whatever. But for me, humanity is about community with each other, with our planet, with God, with all those things. And self-determination is a step toward community. Like, I can't be in community if I don't have the ability to determine things for myself and my own feelings to a certain extent. You know what I mean?
Well, I don't think that can be isolated.
But if self-determination is the greatest good at the expense of all other things, you get capitalism. You get the things that brought us problems that we're here because of that. So for me, that can't be the end of humanity. Is I, in the very end, am my own person, and to hell with everything else. Like that's an essential part of good community, that I am my own person kind of thing. But that's one tiny part of a bigger picture of the interconnectedness of our world. So I think for me, theologically, I do go back. This goes back to teleology. What are humans for? Why do we exist? What is the ultimate human good? And I think it is for building up community. And that goes back to like my theology. I do believe we should be taking care of the world.
Well, I think that's problematic too, though, because community can often turn into tribalism. And I know you've talked about that in the past, that you don't like tribalism.
That's why I say the world.
Right. The
and
global
maybe the whole
community,
universe.
The global community. And for me, that's
Yeah.
what human flourishing means. It's not an individual human flourishing, because I don't believe individuals can be isolated from their larger
Absolutely.
context. We can't. There's just not. That's not real, I don't think. So we are much larger than our own individual interior or bodily lives.
And as a species, we can't separate ourselves from the rest of the species in the world, or as a world from the rest. And maybe the picture goes even bigger. So maybe someday we will be an intergalactic species, right?
So why does progress matter, though? This is the whole question. Is the world getting better or worse? Why does that question matter? Why do we care about that question?
Because we don't want to throw good money after bad.
Is it about commodification? Is it about economics?
No, it's like why live for the community if it's only going to get worse and worse and worse? And that's what Jeff was talking about.
What if it's not getting better or worse? Why do we have to measure that at all?
That's my thought. I don't think we can necessarily measure it, because nobody has access to what the ultimate human good is. I have what I believe, but if I push that whole like community goodness of humanity thing on other people, I begin to do the things that are the problem in the first place.
Well, I think
but
what you said, though, it doesn't have to necessarily have a religious undertone, and I think that's probably the closest thing we have. Human flourishing and global community and like global human rights and uplift is like the closest thing we have to like a universal ethic today. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, but in contemporary ethics, like, because you can do like Christian ethics or Buddhist ethics or Muslim ethics, and you can like have your faith like really strongly intertwined. But when you try to bring those values to the public square and you say, well, God wants us to love each other, then people will go, well, I don't believe in God and I can't participate in that because I'm ideologically excluded. So we have to
But I would say most of those people would believe in self-determination. And for me, in my Christianity, self-determination is a central component. God has given us the freedom to determine certain things. And so if you sin against somebody else's agency, you're breaking like the first relationship that God has created with us, is that we are human beings and are able to make choices, etc.
Yeah. No, and you can be inspired by your faith. You can believe that completely. Like, that's what I don't think people understand about pluralism and living in like a global society. Is like, nobody's trying to take your personal beliefs away from you. If that inspires you to be a better person in the world, awesome. If that inspires you to shoot for more humane technological advances, awesome. But unless it can be considered a universal ethic if not everybody can agree with the central theoretical tenets of it. So if it means assuming there's a God, if you have an ethics that's completely wrapped around God, or a conception of history progressing that's wrapped around God, like not everyone can participate in it, and therefore you can't make claims or assumptions on it that will goad people into action. Like you can't walk into
you can make those claims, and I do believe God has a purpose for the world and for us, and freedom is a really big part of that, freedom of the human being and of creation. But that doesn't mean I can make that an actionable faith for other people. That's absolutely, you can't.
Well, you can make those claims, but it's not like the highest kind of claim. Like actually human flourishing, like
for sure. It's
really, really, really hard to debunk human flourishing as an ultimate good. Like from any religious perspective, you kind of can't do it. So that's why it becomes like, that becomes a meta ethics. That becomes something that we can all buy into. I mean, that's why we have we would try to have the UN.
That's because we're all biologically wired to continue flourishing. That's the only reason right there.
Or we're wired to eat each other.
So back to your question is, why do we believe in a progressive myth? Because we don't want life to suck. I mean, wherever we are, whatever situation we're in, we don't want to believe that everything around us is going to come crashing down. Well, some people do. Some people's whole eternal life is based on that. But for the most part, like even then, if you really break it down, because even with someone, which we'll get into obviously next week when we talk to eschatology, even someone who believes that the world needs to get worse because it all needs to be destroyed because they want to go to heaven, they still have a certain amount of myth of progress within them as they're believing for this one place where everything's going to be better. And I think that's just there's natural. Like I don't have any philosophers to quote or theologians to quote or anything like that. But I know that when I live my life, when the world around me seems hopeless, then the things that I do seem less meaningful. The things that I do seem less important. But if I have this central driving thing that says, well, maybe things are going to get better, I believe things are going to get better, or whatever, then it can bring meaning back into those things, and I'm not just walking around like a drone waiting for the day that I'm going to die.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you said, like the kingdom of heaven is a myth of progress, right? It's a belief that like things are like God's kingdom is coming to earth, or we're going to God's kingdom.
It's a thought of progress. It's not a myth of progress.
It's a belief in progress.
But there's a lot of people who would say, well, okay, yeah.
It's a belief in progress that transcends and trumps whatever's happening on earth.
Jesus inaugurated it, and it's going to expand until a point when the kingdom is fully realized. Yes, that is probably a myth of progress, but some people think that the world's just going to get worse, and the slate is going to be wiped clean. No, I wouldn't call that a myth of progress.
But like Jeff said, those people believe that they're going to a heavenly kingdom, so they're trying to get to a better place. Like, you know, and I think that's a really important point, that we all dream of paradise and utopia. That's part of having hope as humans.
That's the furthest end of it. I think sometimes we just dream for a good day. Like I think we're because we've talked about this a little bit before, but this idea of perfection, everyone's idea of perfection is represented in whatever philosophy they have. I'm not even talking about perfection that we're going to move forward. I'm just talking about that maybe we can take a step forward towards our destination as opposed to concentrating so much on the destination itself. Like that's the thing for me is I think when we get into these conversations and we ask these questions, we disconnect ourselves from the solution in the sense that we're worried so much about, well, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong, and we're asking those questions instead of just being like, well, this is wrong, I can do something about this, and letting it happen there. I think if we talk too much, and you know, ironically, in our podcast, but if we talk too much or we philosophize too much or you know, theological speculation too much or whatever, then we're separating ourselves from being a part of that solution.
But
so maybe the idea...
But there's a real danger, though, in not being really circumspect before you take action, because I know a lot of people...
I agree with that, but there are a lot of people that don't have the time to be afforded to do that. Like if I'm just worried about, you know, walking down the road to get my water for the day and come back safe and not getting robbed or whatever, like you can see that when the church moved towards, because I agree there has to be a balance, but when the church moved towards being its own institution and no longer under the threat of persecution or whatever, then we had more time to think about things, but then we also had time to overthink things. So I think that there's a balance.
There are people who think for a living, and that's their job.
Agreed. But if they lived in a certain political context, they wouldn't have that job because they wouldn't have the time or the opportunity to do it. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but what I'm saying is that you can. Everything's an extreme. So you can overthink stuff and be no good to the rest of the world, or all you can do is just react to every moment and do more damage than good. And that there's that balance place that we have to regulate ourselves. And I believe that we as humanity are capable of doing that, even though sometimes we don't always do it.
But a lot of times we participate in the myth of progress, like through just walking around the world, and we like intentionally how am I trying to say this? This is what really irks me about this, though, is that we really do turn a blind eye to a lot of problems. We really do. And I agree, you can't like give up hope and just say, well, it's all gone to crap and I can't do anything anymore ever again, and lose your reason for being in the world.
But you can't look at those negative things as collateral damage. That's the problem. That's why the myth of progress is dangerous.
It's very dangerous.
But sometimes we need to do something wrong to get right. Like what I'm saying is like we can't expect... that sometimes we talk too much because we're waiting for the perfect solution instead of being willing to try something and fail in order to find the perfect solution. Like there has to be that balance. Like we can plan and try this, but we can't wait for something to be perfect or right, because sometimes the cycle of failure helps us get to that place of right better than anything we could speculate, because sometimes you just can't speculate until you do it.
You're arguing for the scientific method and how the science has progressed. And I think that there's an element of truth to that, whether we're just balancing that with human good and perhaps ecological good, and how those things are a little bit more complicated. Like what you're talking about is easy to see. Everybody really buys into progress. Like you can see it, like we said, every single year. And that's not necessarily intrinsically bad. It's just when it's not balanced with, and this is what I hear you saying, with other things, that it can get carried away like we have right now. I did want to say, though, just real quick to clarify, we talked about like the kingdom of heaven being a myth of progress, and maybe even heaven and an eternal afterlife, us progressing to something better. Like, I come at this conversation as a Christian, and I do believe that like the reason we long for heaven or maybe even progress is that we are at a point in our development as a species, maybe, that we can taste of divinity in a way that maybe other elements of the world can't. Like, I do believe that we have a connection with God in such a way that even whether we believe in God or not, that we have that connection, and that's what drives us to be better, to want to be better people, to want to take care of humanity in a better way, to maybe want to be in an afterlife. I think that has a causative effect. I can't prove it, and it's not for everybody, but that's kind of what drives my religion. Community ultimately means we are headed toward God individually, and maybe we're tripping and stumbling along the way, and maybe we're going to go down in a fiery inferno and destroy everything, but the whole point is that we are supposed to be connecting with the ultimate, and that for me is God.
Well, it's hard for me because people talk about Christianity to like bolster human rights, and people talk about Christianity to use nuclear weapons and guns.
Absolutely.
So it's
yes.
To me, like the God conversation becomes really a sidetrack from what is ultimately toward human flourishing. I would go the opposite direction.
You're saying it can be used in all sorts of ways, and it's almost to the point where it's irrelevant. But I'm just saying, for me personally, that's what drives my part of the conversation.
That's
even
great.
Though it's
I celebrate that.
Not for other people.
But for me, it's I would much rather that we put that aside and do more work before we just bulldoze a big forest.
Listen to Mona bulldozing my theology and saying, let's put that to the side so we could do really good stuff.
I didn't
You sound so empirical. Look at that, or whatever. Like,
I just said I celebrated your beliefs, brah.
You said it, but then you said, but let's put that aside because it's irrelevant to the conversation.
All right,
well, if this conversation is a picture of the myth of progress, then maybe progress is a myth because I feel like we're moving to a different direction.
No,
so
it's good. You know what? There's some really good points that I really have to think about.
This is the irony, is that myth of progress has been like in a lot of ways a pretty liberal strain. Like people who have a high view of evolution are like, well, we're evolving into better humans, and that's lately has been largely debunked, even though there's optimisms coming back in some ways. But I think it's funny for me to say this because I don't hold to a concept of original sin, but I really do believe, like, give people a week without food and power and we turn back into animals. Like our reptilian and basic brains takes over, and we're ready to kill and eat people, like all the end of the world movies. And I think honestly, this is why humans lately, like if you look at media since 2008, we have like a total obsession with end of the world and apocalyptic media. Total obsession. I think because we realize that we're like, even in our very technological state, when we have the internet, all of us basically in this country, many of us have the internet, access to the internet and access to all of human knowledge. We're still so frail. We're still like a couple days away from like ending as a society. Like all it would take is like a week for our whole economy to collapse. So I'm not trying to be a doomsday sayer, but I'm saying, like, if we're going to hold to a myth of progress, let's do it in a way that's really well informed about the actual state of reality, the actual state of our environment, the actual state of our economy, and let's be intelligent about it. That's what I was going to say.
The reason that there's the reason that since 2008 we have all that is because we feel the air getting hotter around us. We're like snakes that can feel vibrations in the ground, and we don't even know what's going on, but we can feel it in the air. We feel the earth warming up, and we see it coming.
So do we panic, or do we focus our energies? And that's the thing. I think sociologically we've developed into a very passive species who, like Noam Chomsky writes about this, like our consent has been manufactured. The patterns of our thought have been manufactured through engaging in social media and popular media. So will we have like that? That's the nice part about a society that's been very cultivated and manufactured, like thought wise, that it's orderly, but we're also very kind of impotent when it comes to big social change. And so I think being an activist is one of the best ways, like getting involved in protests and activist work is one of the best ways to cultivate your personal sense of agency and to participate in the world and to actually make the myth of progress real. Like, and that's the thing, like humans have to do it. It's not just going to happen on its own because, God wills it, because we have had ages in the past where we've tanked as people. We've blown each other up. We've killed each other. We've
right now
raped and pillaged.
Like the last 500 years. Yeah.
God does not
machine is
prevent
not
us.
moral.
God does not prevent us from doing horrible things to each other. We have
right,
to
so-
do it.
I think that's
Sorry,
There's a lot
I'm
more.
getting. Am I getting intense a little bit? I'm getting mad about it.
I think the whole conversation is fantastic and wonderful, and no, it is. But we don't want to go too long. We can probably go forever. So, any takeaways before we move into our own micro version of the myth of progress and talk about our New Year's resolutions?
I don't. I would just say, if you think we missed the whole point, go ahead and let us know. You can email me, and we can talk about what you say in our next episode, because we will talk about the end of the world, right? Are we doing that?
Yes.
Sweet. Very good.
I think my takeaway is I think it's really important for each of us to examine what we've internalized and what our view of this is and how it causes us to act in the world. So don't take it from us. What have you been taught? What do you hold to? What gives you hope for being in the world? And what maybe could you let go of that is holding you back from actively participating in the world?
Oh my gosh, sorry. You just gave me a takeaway. After listening to you, I'm so inspired. I would just say, live with both eyes open. Don't assume good is good for everybody. That's it.
And I would say, if you believe the world is getting worse, then do something about it and make the world around you better. If you believe it's getting better, then whatever you're doing, do it better. And wherever you're at in the world, do something good that affects your world, not just you. So I think that's where I will land. Anyway, if you have any thoughts on this, obviously there's a lot to talk about. You can do that and comment at the show notes at irenicast.com/44. And then any general feedback is headed into the new year. We're still looking for topic ideas. Let us know what you think of the show overall at irenicast.com/feedback. And now we will move into our segment this week, which will be talking about our New Year's resolutions, or again, lack thereof. So we're going to be a little cliche this week, since it is the first episode of the year. We'll talk about New Year's resolutions. Do you two make New Year's resolutions?
No.
Sometimes, yes.
Sometimes yes and no. And I do actually every year. Whether I write it down or not, I always do. So Mona, why don't you make them? Was there a specific instance where you're like, I'm not going to do this anymore, or you've just never been?
I feel like if it was that important to you, you would just work on it and you wouldn't have to wait for a special holiday that comes around once a year to promise yourself that you're going to improve yourself. Just do it.
I did do a New Year's resolution last year, and I completed it. That was fantastic. It was the first one. I have set so many, and
Wait, what did you complete though?
Last year I read one book a week.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah, but everyone's like,
impressed by that.
that's so cool, but you just have a lot of free time. If dude just did some work, wouldn't have time to read.
So you accomplished something, and now you're totally devaluing your accomplishment.
It was actually really fun.
Wait a minute though. If you accomplish it, you have every right to freaking revel in that accomplishment
No.
and feel really
Exactly.
great about yourself. Yeah, don't get this false humility crap out of there. Like you
know what?
have
Don't
earned
say
it.
false humility, because it really hurts me. It's actually real humility. And when you say false,
What's real humility?
It makes me feel
no,
even
devaluing
worse.
your accomplishments is not real humility.
Okay. Sorry, I was abused in my spiritual upbringing.
Oh my goodness. This is taking an interesting
Alan.
turn. So
It is.
Alan,
Yeah.
Anyway,
your New Year's
so
resolution this year, what was it?
my New Year's resolution this year, actually, I started like half a month early, so I don't even know if I can call it a New Year's resolution, but I resolved not to eat meat this year. And I won't get into all the reasons why until we have our ecology episode, because I'm going to make you guys do it at some point.
And I've been torturing you by sending you vegan and vegetarian
So
memes.
funny. Yeah, I know. She sent me a picture, well, to put this up, of carrots inside of the inside of a remote. And it's,
Like
it
in
says,
place of the batteries?
Yeah. It has some explicative and it says vegans. Because, that's veggie power. That's good. That's good stuff.
It said
so
vegans,
I was going to
SMH,
go totally
yeah.
vegan. And I did that for a month almost. And I decided, I read a lot of stuff about health and some other things. And I decided that I would make one concession and I would eat cage-free eggs.
You have a good amount of willpower, though. That's fantastic. That's good for you.
All All right, so Mona, if you were going to make a New Year's resolution, what's something that you would want to see better?
Here's the thing, you guys. I turned 30. I'm feeling a little bit old.
Yeah.
My feet don't work anymore. I had to get orthotics. No, seriously. It's like kind of not funny. I had to get orthotics in my shoes. And so, because it happened around the holidays, because of the holiday sales, I got some orthotics and now I'm able to work out more. So just by happenstance, I'm trying to get in shape, but it has nothing to do with flipping New Year's, okay? I'm just doing it. Because you know what? I feel like in society, especially where like body stuff is concerned, like you are measured as a person by how much willpower you have to like be an animal and like get in shape and eat right. And I'm bothered by that. I don't like my personal sense of power being measured by how much I weigh or what I look like. I don't like it. So I try to like be subversive, but I have to balance that with the fact that like I don't want to be unable to walk by the time I'm 45. So I want to be healthy and I want to, I just want to be healthy.
So what's yours, Jeff? Did you say you had one?
I do. I every year have several, and I guess it's not like a formal thing where I'm like, I got to do this, but I think I get caught up in the air of like it's a new year, and I've always been a planner. So December is always my mode of thinking of the next year. So I can't help but apply that personally. So I also, I do a lot of house cleaning and organizing during December and trying to get this going. And so while I'm doing all these things about organizing it, it puts my mind into a place of, okay, so what's next for me and all that kind of stuff. So I guess for me, like I want to do more cooking. But the main thing, honestly, like not to be too self-congratulatory, like my concentration is this show and possibly, spoiler alert, another show for our, little niche in the future.
Sounds good. All that talk of cooking is making me hungry.
I know, right?
Yeah, I'm going to go eat some eggs and like laugh at Alan.
Hey, if they're cage-free, I'll feel better, all right?
They're cage-free. They're omega cage-free, all right? I do not mess around with my eggs.
The chickens I eat eggs from eat vegetables and get proper nutrition.
Did you meet them?
No, see, that's actually the next step. I do live in a place where people do have farms, and I am going to find a farm somewhere where they treat animals right. The problem is they kill them when they no longer have eggs. It's really sad.
Well, yeah, what good are they?
Oh, my God.
What's their tell-us?
See, exactly. What's their tell-us? Oh, it's for human consumption.
Well,
no.
Listen.
No.
What's the point of farming to have a bunch of infertile chickens just taking up space? Okay, they could be food. They don't have a higher brain to process their own feelings and existence.
Whoa.
They don't have consciousness. Chickens don't have consciousness.
Wait. They have the ability to form attachments. And just because you can't perceive their consciousness...
They're not conscious of their consciousness. That's what consciousness is.
So for you, that's when it's...
You're conscious of your consciousness.
So you would eat gorillas because they're not consciousness of their consciousness.
No, they're conscious of their consciousness.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
So if there's a human being that's not, would you eat them?
This took a turn.
So I feel like a ref this week. Jeez. Okay, so... that'll do it for us this week. Let us know your resolution or anything that you'd like to talk to us about at our website at
And please do not spread rumors that Mona is part of the Donner Party or would opt to be, because listen, Alan is not a good person.
Whoa. All right.
Don't knock on cannibalistic societies. Look at you.
My goodness. Wait, don't knock on cannibalistic. All right. Let's that'll do it for us this week for real this time.
We do not support cannibalism.
So if you like what you hear or you're completely offended by what you hear, you can comment at the show notes at irenicast.com/44, or you can just comment on the show in general at irenicast.com/feedback. And also, we forgot to announce last week, but we are on Instagram. So check us out on Instagram at irenicast, and there you'll get some pictures of your hosts and little sneak previews into some of the subjects we have coming up soon, and some behind the scenes, not footage, but what's just a still picture? Just picture? Not footage? Behind the scenes?
It's just a picture.
Image?
It's just a picture.
Whatever. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation.
And stay tuned for Mona's family singing Jingle Bells as a wrap up to the holiday season.
Yes.
Laughing all the way. Ha ha ha!
Bonnie Bright was seated by my side. She let us something and tried to take us something. We got into a drifting fight and we got upset. Whoa!